welcome to the program. What better way to start our interview series on Season 3 than in outer space, or at least talking about outer space? Can you think of a topic that has more implications for all of us on this planet than space exploration, space science, as well as potentially the private investments that could lead to new businesses in space? It's been a topic throughout the international community that's captured a lot of imagination, captured a lot of attention, and begun to strike up a global conversation about how and when and where we invest in space exploration, in outer space infrastructure, and in general, how we think about balancing the needs that we have right here on Earth with pushing the boundaries of discovery in the world beyond our planet. So we think this is going to be a topic that continues to come up, and we love our audience to get different perspectives, both perhaps those who are very promotional of all the different space exploration and space science that's taking place today, as well as the space tourism that we're seeing from private companies, and just the concept of man exploring other planets. So to explore some of these topics and to kick off our Season 3 interview series, I'm going to be joined today by Kate Howells, an expert communicator and passionate advocate for space exploration. Kate serves as a senior communications advisor at the Planetary Society, one of the world's leading organizations advancing space science and exploration. She's also a member of Canada's Space Advisory Board, where she helps shape national space policy and strategy. Kate has spent her career making the case for why space matters to us here on Earth, not just for astronauts and engineers, but for all of us. Her work bridges science and public engagement, helping people understand the values of space exploration and solving real-world problems, inspiring future generations, and expanding the frontier of human knowledge. In our conversation, we talked about the promises and the perils that come with space travel, as well as exploration, how public perceptions of science are changing, and how space exploration in particular is changing those perceptions. And I asked some of her thoughts about the bolder ambitions we've heard from the billionaires of the world, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and others, how they're trying to shape the future of space travel and exploration, and how collectively governments are pushing the boundaries of what we think of as possible, as well as what we all think is ethical and responsible. We covered a lot of ground in this conversation, recorded in early May 2025. I will caveat this with a couple of points. Number one, there are a couple topics we cover in here that are time sensitive. So depending on when you're listening to this show, we talked a little bit about a budget proposal in the United States that would dramatically decrease funding for NASA, which is the probably most well-known publicly funded space agency in the world. And we don't know how that will turn out. By the time you're listening to this show, there may have been a lot of changes on that. So bear in mind, we were recording this in early May of 2025. Where that budget conversation ended up, we don't know as of the recording of this show. But that's an item that we thought was very important to cover. And at the time that we're publishing this, is still an ongoing debate. The other comment we want to make is that, Kate is here speaking on behalf of herself. She'll make a disclaimer here at the beginning that she's speaking here as an expert herself and not on behalf of the Planetary Society or any other organization. And so while we advocate for the work of that society, and they have a wonderful podcast, by the way, I highly recommend that if this episode interests you and you get really interested in the topic of space exploration and space science, the Planetary Society has an excellent podcast. Highly recommend that you subscribe to it if you love what you hear today. Go sample the show. We've got links to that in the description of this program. But that is where you can get the formal points of view and conversations that the Planetary Society endorses. But we try when we can to bring on experts like Kate who can help us all understand a little bit better these big conversations that are out there. And the only way you can really do that is to allow people to be themselves and allow people to have their own opinions independent of who they work for. In the same way that I would expect the same freedom, that I speak on behalf of myself and no one else. And I represent no interests, no employers, or no government agencies of any kind. So with all of that in mind, it's my honor to present to you the first interview of Season 3 of the Brian J. Matos podcast with Kate Howells. Kate, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So I always love to give our guests an opportunity to introduce themselves to our audience. I've given the audience a biographical introduction, but if you'd be so kind as to give us a little bit about your background and what drew you to interest in space travel and space science.
Yeah, so I have been working in the space field for about a dozen years, and actually only got interested in space like 2 or 3 years before that. So I was in the midst of an undergraduate degree and I was studying psychology. I was interested in brains and minds and all that. And I picked up a secondhand copy of the Carl Sagan book, Cosmos. And it is about humanity's exploration of the solar system and about sort of space science and exploration in general. And I was just completely enthralled. And I felt like this is what I need to be doing. I need to be involved in some capacity. And so through a series of sort of trial and error attempts to get involved, recognizing that I was not the person who was going to get, a PhD in astrophysics or something, I wound up working with the Planetary Society, which is a nonprofit organization that does public outreach and advocacy in support of planetary science and exploration. I do stuff on the outreach side. That's really been my sort of purpose in my career for the last 10 plus years, is teaching people about space and why it's so cool and so interesting and so important to study, and how it can kind of relate to things that you care about. And I should say right off the top that throughout this conversation, I'm going to speak pretty freely about my own opinions about things to do with space exploration, space tourism, all that. And what I say does not represent what the Planetary Society stands by. You can go to planetary.org to learn more about what the organization thinks about all of this.
Excellent. We're glad to have you and to have your expert opinion on the topic. So why don't we begin with, in general, we'll step back to a high level of space exploration. And so much of what we hear today is about the flashy space tourism and sending celebrities to space and all of that. Many people listening to this podcast can remember an era when, space exploration was an international competition of scientists to see who could reach the moon first, who could, orbit satellites first, all of this. And we seem to be in some sort of a middle area today. So why don't we begin with, we're sitting here in 2025 having this conversation. In your expert view, what are the most compelling reasons that humanity should continue to invest in space exploration, regardless of exactly how we pursue that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think right off the top, I want to tease apart a couple of concepts or a couple of sort of parts of this endeavor that people often kind of lump together, which is scientific exploration and spaceflight. And like you said, yes, historically spaceflight has been more scientific. Although I would argue that the Apollo program, like the space race in the 60s, was more about like geopolitical posturing. It was capitalism versus communism. It was kind of about who's the best as opposed to purely pursuing scientific goals, but still, it did sort of open up an era of scientific exploration, contrasted with what we see now with space tourism, which is very much about providing individual people with unique experiences. It's cruise ships versus Jacques Cousteau. Like there's very different goals here. I'm a big advocate for scientific exploration. So whether that's sending humans to Mars to further some of our research, that like some of the goals that we have scientifically for understanding Mars and the possibility of life there, or perhaps it's more sending robotic probes out to Jupiter's icy moons, or space telescopes that can look at distant galaxies. I think any of that kind of science motivated space exploration is so valuable because it has the potential to answer huge questions about why we're here. What are we doing on this planet that has developed life, and the complexity and diversity of life that Earth has, and intelligent beings. Like, some people might argue that humans aren't all that intelligent, but really what we've become on this planet is so special. And when you look out into the cosmos and you see no signs of any other life so far, it really demands the question of like, why, what's out there, where did we come from, how do we fit into all of this, what is our place in the universe. Those are huge questions that I think have a lot of potential meaning behind them. And I think pursuing those is just essential for us to just keep trying to understand ourselves and where we fit into all of this.
So, as you think about this, how do you think about it in terms of investment, for private
Hmm.
investment versus public investment? And I ask this in the context of countries like the United States that have really seen a surge in commercial investment from individuals, and we'll get into some of that later in the conversation. But there hasn't necessarily been a groundswell of support from the public taxpayers. Now that's just one
Hmm.
country. This is an international endeavor. But I wouldn't say that the public governments of the world have really shown much of an appetite for this investment, and it might be because we're seeing commercial investment. So, as looking at this from a scientific perspective,
Hmm.
do you think the entrance of commercial players to this space has been a net positive, at least in some ways, for what we've learned from it? Or do you think that because we have commercial interests now, it has actually diminished the public investment and the public benefits that could come from space exploration?
Hmm. That is a fantastic question because, yes, commercial actors are coming in to the space, if you will, and that has both benefits and potential threats to scientific exploration. The benefits are that companies like SpaceX, for example, has come in, like in decades past, it has revolutionized rocketry, where now you can get things out into space, whether that's a satellite that's going to orbit the Earth and study climate, or it's a fleet of communication satellites, or it's a spacecraft that's going to go out to another planet. That can be done much more cheaply thanks to innovations that have come from private industry. Now, I will say though that the key difference is that private industry is never going to be incentivized economically to actually pay for scientific missions. You're never going to see SpaceX or Blue Origin or any of the other big commercial companies paying to design and build a scientific probe. So something like the Juno spacecraft that is currently studying Jupiter, that is something that is only really ever going to be paid for with public money because it doesn't bring any return on investment in the traditional business sense. The benefits that a mission like that yield are knowledge and perspective and discovery, and those are things that are of value to the public, and they're things like big infrastructure projects that only the government really pays for. Um, so I don't see private industry ever taking over space science. There's no reason for them to do it economically, and that's what drives private industry. It has to be profit. That being said, there is an economic return on investment for a government to pay for these things. So when, like, I know the numbers for NASA, at least. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head for other space agencies, but I assume it would be similar, where every dollar that the US government invests in NASA brings back $3 to the US economy. And that's because the money that NASA spends is going to pay the salaries of highly skilled workers. It is going to um, supporting American companies that build the actual components of spacecraft. It feeds back into the economy. That wouldn't be the case for a company, but it works for a government. And if I may go on, in terms of the threat that the rise of private industry in space poses, I think it really has to do with public opinion because, as you said, citizens have to be supportive of public investment in space. So, right now in the US, we are seeing the president's budget request for 2026 calls for a huge cut to NASA, including about a 47% cut to NASA's science budget. So, that is just a massive, 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 devastating cut that would set American space science back decades. If the public doesn't care about that cut, it'll go ahead. But if people care about it and speak up, Congress could be incentivized to reject that cut. This is kind of getting into complicated policy stuff, but I think that the threat that we see from private space industry, specifically space tourism, the billionaires and the celebrities going to space, is that the average person who sees that thinks, this is this is not for me. This doesn't represent me. This does not benefit me. This is bad. This is garbage. And so they might lump that in with NASA and just think space is space, space travel, space tourism, space exploration. It's all space. It's all the same thing. So then when they see NASA's getting cut, they might think, good, fine. I don't want to spend my money on sending billionaires to space anymore. And so I think that threat to the public opinion on space exploration and space funding is really serious.
So I'm going to use an example, and it's a U.S. centric example. So for the international audience, there may be similar examples in other countries, but I'm most familiar with the U.S. Our defense industry. It is one of the biggest pots of money that there is, frankly, in the world. And one of the arguments that's been made in defending spending on defense is that there's innovation that comes out of it that can eventually be applied to civilian purposes.
Hmm.
So even though the core of the investment might be for advancement of the U.S. defense posture, in the end, these innovations can be applied and used. The same thing can be said for some of the investments that are done in healthcare research. That the taxpayer picks that up, and once something breaks through, it gets commercialized through a private partnership. So there are these examples where the government is the catalyst of the research,
Hmm.
but there is a tipping point where the commercial sector gets an interest and is able to apply that in a commercially viable way. Do you think that that model that exists for defense, for other technologies, for medications can be applied here? Or do you think this is more of an either or? Either we're investing on the public benefits side in more of a government and philanthropic sense, or it's a commercial investment and these two things are never going to be complementary?
Oh, I think they're absolutely complementary. And actually, I lean towards the sort of philosophical justifications for why we should invest in space research, but there are definitely those sort of technological spin-offs. If any listener just Googles NASA spin-off, NASA puts together a great list every year of all the technologies that have been developed that are beneficial to ordinary people that come from space research originally. And part of this, yeah, is because to do something in space, you're facing some of the most extreme challenges out there, and so it really does drive innovation. I think another element of this too is that space is a very motivating force. A lot of people who go into STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math careers, um, have been inspired at some point in their academic trajectory by space. It's something where you know how many people want to be an astronaut compared to how many people actually become astronauts. And if you want to be an astronaut, you study your butt off in university. You learn all these languages, you get super fit, you do all this stuff. And if you don't wind up becoming an astronaut, you become the most accomplished doctor ever or the most impressive engineer in your field. It's something that really motivates from little kids who get obsessed with space all the way through to people in their PhDs and onward. And these are people who are developing skills that are beneficial to society. They're the people who are making inventions, coming up with engineering breakthroughs, or doing other kinds of science. So I think there very much is that sort of practical, tangible benefit that you do see from those same arguments that you mentioned earlier.
All right, let's turn our attention to probably the most controversial of the topics, which is around billionaires in space, we'll call it.
Hmm.
Whether they're putting themselves in space or they're simply funding what to many appear to be vanity projects.
Hmm.
So I want to get into some aspects of it, but let me just start at the high level. You've alluded to your general view on how this is being absorbed in the public and the
Hmm.
kind of negative connotation. What is your general view on that level of private capital from individuals going into the space exploration slash space commercialization? Do you think this is something that is a net negative, or do you feel like there are at least some positives that can be taken from it, and
Hmm.
you just wish that they'd be, I don't know, partnering with their governments, for
Hmm.
example?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are definitely positives. It's one of those things where, yes, if there are enough people who want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on spending a few minutes in space, that will drive technological development in the same way that we've seen in like aviation industry. People wanted to fly on planes, so airplane technology got better. You might see the same kind of thing, and that could have spin-off benefits. Like I mentioned earlier, where SpaceX, made access to orbit much cheaper. You could see some kind of similar thing potentially. So I'm open to that possibility. There is also the possibility that some of these companies, like Blue Origin or whatever, would grant a certain number of tickets on each of their flights to people who don't have to pay for it, but who are going to conduct some kind of scientific experiment during those few minutes in suborbital space in microgravity. So there is a possibility for some science to be conducted. Um, what I think is most problematic, though, is the public perception, because it does seem, regardless of whether they include some science or give away charitable seats to people who don't have the means to pay for them, but who deserve it in some way. Regardless of all of that, the public sees this and is disgusted because they're seeing the flaunting of wealth in a time when a lot of people are struggling economically. I think it's that I think that reaction is very fair. And as much as some of these companies proclaim that this is going to democratize space, like I said, not everybody gets to be an astronaut. Maybe you could just pay your way into being an astronaut. But really, what we're seeing is a very, very visible display of wealth, extreme wealth in some cases, that I think is reasonably not well received by the public, and I think that that's important. The other thing that I always have to mention here is that so far these space tourism missions have been successful. There's always the possibility of a failure happening that leads to the loss of life, and that is very serious. NASA and other space agencies that send astronauts into space operate in extreme caution, and that's part of what makes it so expensive for public space, like human space flight programs. They have to be very, very cautious. They really, really, really want to avoid accidentally killing their astronauts, and it's happened in the past. We've seen space shuttle disasters. I think the risk tolerance for private companies is always just going to be a lot higher, where they um, again, because it's sort of the financial incentive is there to sell more seats and do things more cheaply. I'm not saying that these companies are operating irresponsibly, but I think that the possibility is there. And again, that these tourist flights are so publicized that you have a very real possibility of millions of people seeing a crew of paid tourists dying in a horrible explosion. And again, that taints the public's perception of what's acceptable and could have effects on how the public perceives and supports government funded space programs.
You mentioned the sort of comparisons to the early days of the now modern commercial aviation industry, and you do
Hmm.
hear some advocates for these commercial investments saying something similar, that it's hard for us to imagine it today, but in another generation, you could have routine space travel that could be done safely, it could be done affordably. You would want to have, sort of like we have airports today, the places in the world that are hubs for this activity. How do you view that? Do you think that is a fair comparison to think of the early days of aviation and that we might be in that chapter, or do you feel this is really a fundamentally different dynamic and we have no need for or shouldn't be pursuing this idea of, commercial travel through and to space?
Hmm. Um, I mean, I don't know. Honestly, I will say that I don't have enough knowledge of the technological limitations of suborbital spaceflight. Because when we talk about sending tourists to space, they're not going fully like out into outer space. They're not orbiting the planet. They're going just high enough to kind of be technically in space and floating around and stuff, and then they come back down. So it's called suborbital flight. And there have been proposals of using suborbital flight, yes, to cross the planet much more quickly, getting from New York to London in an hour or whatever. Don't quote me on that, but that's the general idea. Um, I don't know whether that'll actually ever become economically viable. Like, again, not as an expert in aviation, but you look at something like the Concorde jet that was so much faster than the other jet aircraft that we have, but it just didn't pan out, and it was because it just didn't work economically. And I think you could see the same kind of thing here. The other concern that I know a lot of people have is about the environmental impact. Air travel is already a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and getting somewhere more quickly by going through in a rocket or in a space plane or something like that into suborbital space, that's going to emit more um, greenhouse gases. So I think the question of, can we develop suborbital commercial space flight, um, is needs to be accompanied by the question of, should we?
So I'm glad you brought up the environmental impacts, because
Hmm.
this was my next question in thinking about the commercial versus the public. I feel like there's a perception that when research is being done, credible, legitimate, in the public interest research, that whatever fossil fuels or other pollutants that are emitted in the process of space travel is sort of tolerated in the name of advancing science that will ultimately be better for the planet and for all of us who live on it. In the commercial space, it feels like there is very deep skepticism that they're doing
Hmm.
anything other than what all industries have done, which is potentially harm the environment without any real impact to the benefit for the public, but maybe for a few individuals.
Hmm.
How do you, as a science somebody who obsesses over the science of these things, how do
Hmm.
you balance the potential impacts to the environment versus the benefits? And this, you can take this from both the commercial and from, the public investment, because these do require humongous amounts of fuel, and
Yes.
nobody can argue that it is definitely a significant contributor to pollution if we were to actually see a significant increase in space tourism, in space travel, even in traditional space exploration. How do you
Hmm.
think about where that break even point is between how much we're willing to burn and, what the benefit we get from that is?
Hmm. Well, I would say that from the science perspective, the number of science missions that launch each year is so tiny compared to the number of communication satellites or military satellites that are launched every year. We launch lots of stuff into space, and the vast majority of it is not about science. It's about something that is practical to us or makes money. So, you've got like satellite internet and satellite radio, and like, it's all of these different kinds of technologies that are for profit or for basic uh, needs of people here on Earth, whether that's governments or consumers or whatever. Scientific missions are a tiny drop in the bucket, so I don't think that that's something to be concerned about. I wouldn't focus on that. I would say that yes, the return on investment for the public, the benefit to the public of something like, yeah, launching tons of communication satellites, it's there. You want to be able to go out and take out your smartphone and look at a map and have it accurately tell you where you're going. That all relies on satellites. So we do need to, like, people need these things being launched. If you cut out all launches of science missions, that wouldn't really change anything significantly. I think what we're seeing with tourism is similar to what people have started to notice about celebrities flying everywhere in private jets. Where it's like the emissions from that is so much bigger than the emissions that an ordinary person contributes through their entire year of air travel. And I think people have kind of caught on to that and are unimpressed that a small number of people are just jetting around, and the rest of us are being kind of told, like, oh well, make sure you throw your can in the recycling, or else you're ruining the environment. So I think the kind of laying of blame is a little bit uneven, and I think you could say the same thing with scientific versus tourist kind of space launches.
So let's talk a little bit about, and I'm going to do my best to represent what I understand, the sort of the big names who have been investing in this commercially, how they have at least publicly talked about it. So, Elon Musk is probably the most famous among
Hmm.
all of these folks. He's really made a mission of colonizing Mars, or putting, permanent human settlements on Mars. So we'll call that sort of the ambitious, interplanetary population idea.
Hmm.
I think Jeff Bezos has talked a lot about how space based infrastructure can significantly change the logistics of moving things around on this planet, improve life for people, and that's a key component of human advancement. And then I would categorize Bill Gates's vision as more of using space travel, exploration, and infrastructure to solve fundamental problems on this planet. And I wouldn't say has been super specific on that, but that seems to be that general vision. So, how do you interpret those philosophies? And do you feel like any one of them, actually has some legitimacy if placed within a scientific framework?
Hmm. I certainly think that the Bill Gates perspective of using space to benefit people on Earth and will solve real problems on Earth, I think that's very valid. I'll just quickly say I think Jeff Bezos's approach. It sounds to me like saying like, hey, in the same way that building Amazon warehouses everywhere and having drones deliver packages that makes life better for people is I think that's very questionable on a grand scale. Um, I think if you have the same kind of approach with space, where yeah, we can build up all this infrastructure that benefits people, it's happening within a very like reckless capitalist framework, I would expect. And again, this is very much like my opinion, but that's sort of my take on that. I think using space to actually solve problems on Earth is very possible and is very important, and it's something that is already happening. So we use Earth observing satellites to monitor wildfires and droughts and all kinds of other impacts of climate change, seed temperature levels, extreme weather events of all kinds. Like that is so important. And actually, a lot of that Earth monitoring um, capability is being threatened right now with the budget cuts to NASA that are and to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is NOAA. It's like the more Earth focused version of NASA. So Trump is looking to cut a lot of funding for all of this, which would directly reduce our ability to mitigate climate change and its impact on people. So I think sufficiently funding space technologies that can address the issues that we're dealing with on Earth, that's super important. There are some things we can only really do from that bird's eye view of an orbiting spacecraft. Now, to get to Elon, do you want to respond to that before I delve into Elon Musk's whole view?
Well, yeah. I agree with you. Elon Musk's is its own moment. So let's come
Yeah.
back to that one in a second. Let me just double click on what you've said so far about,
Hmm.
you potentially using space exploration, space investment to solve problems on Earth. I think a lot of people view that there's a tension between these two things, that it's an
Hmm.
either or, that every dollar we invest commercially or
Hmm.
private, or through governments, every dollar we invest in sending people, things, drones, whatever, into space, that we're not spending here on this planet to address all kinds of philanthropic needs and all kinds of very serious challenges, that it's money that needs to go to one place or the other. Do you view it as that straightforward of an either or as you said, do you actually think that some of these investments in space can fundamentally improve the challenges we have on Earth, and if we don't invest that money, it will actually make it harder for us to solve those challenges no matter how much we throw at it just on this planet?
Yeah, that latter part of what you said is absolutely my perspective. I don't think it's an either or. The Again, speaking more from the perspective of the U.S., I'm actually Canadian. I live in Canada, but I work for an American nonprofit that is involved in this. So my knowledge of the U.S. side of this is so much more in depth than even my knowledge of the Canadian side of things. So I'll speak to what I know, and that is that the U.S. Federal budget is so big, and so much of it goes to things like things that directly benefit people, like uh, uh, like health services and social security and things like the military that, it depends who you ask whether they think it's of value or not. But the vast majority goes to these things that do directly benefit people. And I mean, that is that is normally. I know right now the US government is in a state of flux, and a lot of funding that used to be just completely normal has been gutted. And so who knows how permanent that will be or what things will look like in the next few years. But traditionally, a lot of money goes to taking care of people, funding medical research, all environmental protections, all those things that very directly address problems that we have here on Earth. A lot of it goes into ensuring that the economy is strong and that people have enough money to live. All of those things. The amount that goes to NASA is less than 1%. So it's not it's not as though cutting that would suddenly free up all this money. And people see things like the price tag on a mission being like some scientific mission that launches. They'll see that it's $1 billion or something, but that's over many years, and that is a very small amount in the context of the federal budget, which is in the trillions. So I think you don't really gain that much by taking that money away and just throwing it into something like medical research or social security or whatever. Um, Whereas, yes, there are types of science that can only really be done from orbit. So, and not just science, but also just monitoring. So, like I said, looking at um, forest fires and being able to track them from up high, like you really can see so much more from that vantage point and be able to get a big picture of what is happening. You can't do that from the ground. You can't do that from airplanes or helicopters or anything that's lower down. And I think just having that perspective, and the kinds of scientific instruments that spacecraft carry, it's invaluable.
All right, so let's come back to the topic of colonizing planets. So,
Hmm.
look, I think our audience recognizes that whenever we layer Elon Musk's name onto anything, it
Yeah,
sort of paints it. So, for the purposes of this, I'm going to remove the name of the individual, and we're just going to
sure.
talk about the general topic. And there are those who are supportive of this, and so I'll recite the argument, and I'd love you to respond, and then we'll go a couple layers deeper on this one. So,
Hmm.
the argument would go that, as bold, audacious, and maybe ridiculous as it may sound to colonize another planet like Mars, it is that kind of big, overwhelming, bold thinking in our era that is similar to the big, bold thinking of sending man to the moon in a different era, and it inspired a generation to strive for this seemingly impossible achievement, and it is worth pursuing if only to inspire international cooperation to achieve the unachievable.
Hmm.
I'd love to hear sort of your response to the public view of those who support that just doing something that big, bold, and audacious in and of itself is worthy of the investments required to accomplish it.
Hmm. Well, so once again, I'm going to tease two things apart that are often kind of conflated, and that is sending humans to Mars and colonizing Mars. So sending astronauts or cosmonauts or whatever nation does it first, um, we if we send somebody to Mars and they land and they take first steps and maybe they plant a flag, maybe we even get to the point like we did in the Apollo program where we send a little Jeep, like a little buggy, and they drive around or they play golf, all those incredible accomplishments that NASA achieved with the Apollo lunar landing program. If we did that on Mars, sure, you could make the same argument that this is a worthy thing to strive for, and that if we work together internationally, we can get it done more effectively and we can build bonds between nations. Yes, it is extremely expensive because keeping human beings alive in space, especially in deep space, is very difficult and costs a lot of money. And even just to send the necessary supplies and equipment to Mars is just it's so much more expensive than just sending a probe that doesn't need food, it doesn't need a place to sleep, it doesn't need oxygen, all these things. But I think that yes, you can certainly make an argument that it is worth it for inspiration, for public engagement, for the science value of what astronauts could accomplish while on Mars. Like if you send a geologist to Mars and they know exactly what types of rocks to look for to best answer the question of whether life has ever existed on Mars, that could have such scientific payoffs. But I think that all of those arguments kind of end with those boots and flags moments, as they say. So the same reason that after the Apollo program ended, we didn't establish a permanent moon base. There's no real reason to do it. And I think you could say the same thing for Mars. Um, there's we don't gain that much more by living there than by just visiting, if what you want is this, inspiring achievement. I think people like Musk, we have to bring him into this because I know he kind of taints everything a little bit for some people, but he has been one of the most vocal advocates for this, and his vision is to have what, like 1 million people living on Mars. That is a very different thing, and I think it requires a totally different framework to think about it. And that's because you have to ask yourself the question of what are all those people doing there, who is paying for it, and how are they being supplied? Because if you look at, for example, the International Space Station, which is where we've had a permanent presence in space for decades, humans have been continuously operating the space station since I think 2000, 2001. It's been decades. But they have to be constantly supplied from Earth, and everything that they do is paid for by governments because there's no economic product that they're producing. And this gets down to like basics of sort of economics of if you have 1 million people on Mars, what are their jobs? What are they doing? What kind of value are they providing? Are they just there building settlements? And if so, who's paying for all of that? Because having the public pay for it back on Earth doesn't really make any sense. On the other hand, there's been talks of asteroid mining. So if you had a group of astronauts live on a asteroid and mine it for precious metals and then sell those precious metals to Earth, there you've got a viable colony. But a colony on Mars doesn't really make any sense. Um, and so I think I don't see it really happening, but just because it's so expensive and it doesn't really seem self-sustaining in any way, um, I'm sure, lots of people who strongly disagree with me, but that's my perspective on it.
What would you say about those who then take it to the next step and they say, well, we have to have viable alternatives in case we make the planet that we live on unsustainable, unlivable, or large sections of it. Now
Yeah.
we're getting off into a little bit of the distance there, but this has
Hmm.
been part of the public dialogue, and I think even Elon Musk and others have at least brought it up as a maybe 200 years from now kind of thing we should think about. Do you think there's any credibility at all to that, or we better figure it out on this planet, or we've got no plan B?
Yeah. It's definitely worth addressing because it is a very popular perspective. My take on it is, how are we going to make the Earth more inhospitable to life than Mars already is? Like, in what scenario is it easier to maintain life on Mars, which has no magnetic field to protect from solar radiation, basically no atmosphere, certainly no breathable atmosphere, extremely low temperatures, no water? Like, there's a lot of reasons why it would be extremely difficult to live on Mars. I understand that we are doing terrible things to Earth and to the ecosystems that we depend on, and I do think that that some bad things are going to happen in the future for humans if we don't correct that course. But I still don't think we're going to get to a point where it's more difficult to live on Earth than on Mars. Now, the flip side of this, I think, is the other common argument is that Earth's population is going to grow to the point that we can no longer rely on the resources that Earth can provide, and we will have to expand. There just won't be room for all of us here. And I would still say there are places on Earth that we have not expanded. Let's go to Antarctica. Yeah, it's not super hospitable, but you can breathe the air at least. I think there's a lot of Earth that we could expand to that makes so much more sense than expanding to another extremely hostile planet.
Now, if we take it back to a more commercial potential, and so this is maybe more of the Bezos argument, we'll call it,
Hmm.
that when we get to a point that advanced robotics, for example, and other tools, that we're going to have more automation on Earth as it is, and that it's conceivable that if there is some version of that industry that is very harmful to our environment here, but if only we could move it out to space and it doesn't require people, we're just moving the machines that do all this equipment, but we're moving them off this planet so that
Hmm.
we don't pollute this planet. Now, I still don't know how you get it up there without polluting
Yeah.
things. but but again, it's an argument that I've heard that okay, human sustaining human life in space is very expensive, very challenging, may not be viable. But if we are able to automate more of our industry anyway, and we have less humans doing that work, why couldn't we do it off planet? Do you have a thought or a reaction to that?
I think you'd need launch technology to be completely revolutionized. Because right now, for any given object that you want to launch into space, like, yeah, say it's some kind of machinery or whatever, or the raw material that machines are going to be processing in space, um, most of the weight of the rocket that is launching that is the fuel required to launch that. And so a lot of that fuel is actually being used to launch the rest of the fuel because that fuel is so heavy. So it's just this kind of, it spirals out of control where that's why it's so expensive. That's why it's so potentially environmentally damaging to launch everything into space. It's the reason we don't launch our garbage into space. Like it costs a lot financially and environmentally. So if there were some revolution, if we developed, fusion reactors and we could find a clean, cheap way of getting rockets out of Earth's gravity well, sure, yeah, sure, we could do all of our industrial processes in space, but that's not really on the table yet, I would say. So I think it's something to fantasize about. I think yes, I would encourage everybody who's in those fields to pursue better launch technology that benefits everybody for every reason. But so far, that's a huge obstacle.
So I think the other topic that comes up around all of these theories is how do we make sure that whatever investments are made commercially or publicly, that the benefits are actually realized by a large number of people and not ultimately commercialized by a very small number.
Hmm.
And so when you think about even going back to fundamental space exploration for the purposes of scientific advancement, how do we ensure that any achievements that we make in this space don't just become, sort of a profit center or a playground for a small number of people, but we actually are able to ensure that everybody who lives on this planet in some way can participate? Do you feel like we even have the international structures in place to ensure that a major discovery or a major advancement can benefit all, or is this going to be, hey, whoever gets there first, that country gets the benefit and everybody else is left out?
I mean, I think for the most part, the benefit is knowledge, right? So if we discovered that there are alien microbes living on Jupiter's moon, Europa, like we hope maybe there are. Everybody gets to have that knowledge. Everybody gets to benefit from the shift in perspective that generates. When we take beautiful images of like nebulas and stuff with space telescopes, everybody can look at that on the internet. All you need is to go online and you have access to that and you can appreciate that. Science isn't generally the kind of thing where if you get it first, you win. Maybe technology is, but even that, I think it doesn't really have that same issue of like ownership and a claim to the benefits. And generally, space science is very international. The sharing of data, sharing of knowledge is very widespread. That's very much the norm. Science communities move around through, to different countries and network with each other internationally. You don't see that same kind of like siloing. Something like a space race, like where the US is concerned that China is going to land astronauts on Mars before they do. That that has nothing to do with science. That's about, again, just like the Apollo program, it's geopolitical posturing. It's whose country is better, who can get there first. It doesn't really relate to science. I think science is always going to be something that, if we invest in conducting science, and if we ensure that scientists have the freedom to communicate their findings publicly, which that is something that could be threatened for sure. But if we ensure those things, then I think it'll investments in science are always going to be for the public benefit worldwide.
All right. Now, I do want to cover one topic that is not necessarily tied directly to space exploration, but is certainly in the same realm, and that is the interest that it seems that the world's militaries have taken in space for a wide variety of reasons.
Hmm.
And we have heard, although I don't know that anybody outside of a few intelligence officials know the truth of this, but we have heard that there may be some advancements in, or at least attempts to advance space weapons,
Hmm.
which may include countries being able to take out each other's satellites in space.
Hmm.
Which may include space based weaponry. Now, this is a pretty dark turn, quite frankly, for what has been an extremely peaceful endeavor for
Hmm.
science. As somebody who follows this space, and you've clearly expressed your passion for what can be, and it's been a very optimistic and very positive.
Hmm.
How do you think about the implication of now militaries getting involved in this space, and how the public might shift its entire perspective of what space is from a place of wonder and peace to potentially a place of conflict?
Hmm. I will say that uh, war and military might have always been part of space. The very first rockets were developed from intercontinental ballistic missiles. So we repurposed these weapons of war in order to shoot satellites up into space instead of bombs across the world to another country. Most of the major companies in the aerospace industry also participate in the military industry. So there's been they've been in bed together the whole time, space and the military. What we've seen in recent years is a shift in the public's awareness of this, and I think a lot of that came from the initiation of Space Force in the U.S., which was basically just bringing a bunch of existing activities together under one um, management structure. So they didn't initiate development of military space capabilities. Those were already there. That was already happening. They just restructured who oversees it and what department it's in, basically. I think every single spacefaring nation has military interests wrapped up in what they're doing because, yeah, you can spy on your enemies with satellites. You don't need to make a space weapon. You can just crash a satellite into Washington D.C. or any other major city in the world. You can smash a satellite into another satellite. That'll destroy both of them. These capabilities have all been there. I think the the domain of space as like a military and again, I'm not an expert on this specifically. I know a bit about it, but I don't know all the language. But space as a military domain or arena or whatever, it's always been on people's radars. And I think it actually had a lot to do with the space race in the 50s and 60s was, the first satellite that was launched scared everybody because they thought, oh my God, now our enemies can watch us from above like never before. So I think it's always been part of it. It always will be part of it until humans become a completely peaceful civilization. But until then, there are always going to be military elements in space.
All right, so let's turn our attention to the future and what your hopes and maybe some of your expectations are of where space exploration can take us. So, given everything we've talked about in this episode, from the public investment and the private investment and the public's view and all of this, what gives you hope for the future of space exploration? And on the other side of that coin, what's your biggest concern over the coming years,
Mhm.
whether it's from the public or private players in this space?
Mhm. Well, I'll start with my concern so we can end on a happy note. Biggest concern is that NASA's budget is facing incredible cuts, like unprecedented historical cuts. That is very scary because as much as there are lots of other countries that have space programs, but NASA's budget is bigger than all of the rest of the space agencies of the world combined. It is the leader in space exploration. It achieves a lot, and that's not to say that what the other countries are doing is irrelevant, but losing that huge contribution from NASA would be a huge blow to our ability to understand the universe and our place within it. I think that that is a big scary threat. I care about that so much more than I care about the threat of space tourism. Um, what gives me hope is that people are speaking up against these cuts. The Planetary Society, the organization I work for, is rallying people to send letters to Congress, have in person meetings with their representatives, sign petitions, educate other people in their community. So, if anybody listening wants to take action and support NASA's budget, the Planetary Society is the avenue to do that. And we are seeing lots and lots of people, like thousands and thousands of people all across the United States, speaking up. There's a lot of hope that this public wave of support for NASA could turn the tides and save at least some of the funding that is at risk right now. Um, but I think regardless, the world is going to keep exploring space. I think we are a curious species. We want to know where we came from and if we're alone in the universe. I don't think I see us collectively like ever really stopping that search. And so I do have fundamental hope that even if we enter a bit of a dark age, at least in one major spacefaring nation, that it's not the end of it all.
If people would like to learn more about you, your work, any of the things that you've done that you'd like people to have a chance to read or review, what's the best way for people to follow along with you and your work and anything else, frankly, that you'd like to promote?
Yeah, well, I would definitely encourage people to go to planetary.org to learn about space advocacy. I think that's really important. To follow me and my work, my website is kateonearth.com. I'm not really on social media, but I share latest writing, and people can get in touch with me if they want to work with me on anything. I have a book coming out this fall called Moons, the Mysteries and Marvels of Our Solar System, which is all about the various moons in our sort of local cosmic neighborhood. So I encourage people to check that out. I think it's coming out in September, but it can be pre ordered already. And yeah, join the Planetary Society, become a member. And I am always happy to hear from people if they want to get in touch with me through my website.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so many of your insights with our audience. We would love to have, this is such a big topic. We could talk about it for hours. We'd love to have you back at some point, maybe when there's some developments in space exploration or big topics or big news. We'd love to have you back to get your take on it.
Absolutely. There's always something going on in space, so I've got lots to talk about.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
It's hard to think of a topic that captures people's imagination quite as much as space exploration and space travel. It has been the inspiration for some of the most successful Hollywood movies ever made, television shows ever produced, and even beyond pop culture, it is one of the most captivating subjects in any school anywhere. Kids love to talk about other planets. They love to think about going to other planets. They love to imagine what life would be like on another planet. And for adults as well, even the most jaded of adults who are consumed by the issues of daily life, when you give an opportunity for them to sink their teeth into something like a new discovery or new images from another planet, you cannot help but be awestruck and awe-inspired by what exists beyond the bounds of our own planet. I couldn't think of a better way to start off, season 3 in our interview series than talking about that topic. And that's the parting thought I wanted to leave with on this episode. We are going to bring on various guests over the course of this season and future seasons to continue the dialogue around some specific elements of space exploration. I thought Kate was the perfect guest to bring on to, level set on some of the common issues that we think about, we hear about. Maybe if you've had a little bit of time to read up on what, Blue Origin is doing, or, what some of the private investments have been up to over time. What SpaceX has done to advance rocket technology. These things have captured our imagination. We've heard a lot about them, but I don't know how much time people really have to focus on it and to set the table for future dialogue. So that's really what we try to do here today, and I think we accomplished that. But this isn't an episode or a series that's going to have a simple good or bad. And it's not as straightforward as proponents of further investment and opponents of further investment. To the contrary, it's all the various perspectives about how to best approach this topic of space travel, whether through governments or through private companies. Everything from, the jet propulsion technology that gets you into space to what you do once you're there, and where the intersection of economics and defense and ethics and potentially robotics, AI, where all of these fit in this conversation as we think about what we humans would do in outer space, or what technology we would send there to do something for us. So this is a table setter. I hope it was informative, and I also hope that it's inspiring. If you like what we talked about on this show, I would encourage you to go to the Planetary Society's website and listen to their podcast, which is available anywhere you get your podcasts. Very well done. Much more detail on sort of daily topics and, more of the scientific elements. We really tried to keep this accessible and a little higher level to set the table of the issue. But if you really are interested in the science of space exploration and outer space, that's a great podcast. Would strongly encourage you to listen to at least a couple of episodes to just step into that world. And in general, I hope that that this allows you to spend a little bit more time on this topic. And the reason I encourage that is because there's nothing like the perspective of outer space and being beyond our planet and the issues on it. Now, we're going to continue on this program to spend a lot of time talking about the issues we all deal with right here on Earth. But every now and then, as a nice palate cleanser, it's great to think about something beyond the bonds of our planet and to tap into that wonder that we all had when we were kids and we saw the first images of planets through a telescope, or a visit to a planetarium somewhere, and what inspired us about that. If you know someone in your life who could use that perspective, I hope this episode is a great introduction to what we do here on this show. And if they're curious about outer space or the topics of it, or maybe the geopolitical or economic implications of it, this might be a good introduction to that topic and to this show as we continue to expand our community of curious minds. And what could be more curious than the world beyond our own? So I appreciate you all listening to this first interview of Season 3. I encourage you to go back to listen to Seasons 1 and 2 at your leisure. All the archived episodes are available on my website, brianjmatos.com. But of course, if you subscribe to our podcast anywhere you get your podcast, you'll get the entire series all the way back to episode 1. We've covered a lot of ground in this time, but I assure you, almost all those episodes were recorded to be evergreen. They're still as relevant today as they were when they were recorded. And we're going to keep that theme going for this year. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcast. You can also find us on YouTube. We do some exclusive clips there, some Q&A as well, that I think is unique for that audience, if that's where you're listening to this show. But if you do spend time on YouTube, feel free to subscribe to us there. We can reach a different audience than we do on the traditional podcast feed. And as always, if you want to reach out to me with questions or feedback about this episode, any of our episodes for that matter, or things you'd love to hear on this program, you can reach me directly at info@brianjmatos.com. Of course, you can direct message me on any of your favorite social media platforms. And if you're on YouTube, feel free to leave comments and we can dialogue there, both on the individual clips and on the show topics in general. Thank you all for listening to this episode. Look forward to talking to you again very soon. And in the meantime, I encourage you all to stay curious.